So 8 years ago, Israeli professor Yuval Noah Harari published his highly acclaimed book called *Sapiens*, which became an international bestseller. The book is subtitled A Brief History of Mankind. Humans are referred to in science texts as Homo sapiens. This means that like other primates, such as apes and gorillas and baboons and orangutans, chimpanzees, etc., we humans are of the hominid genus, and sapiens refers to our having intellect. So we are, you could say, the intellectual ape, if you will. What exactly is this intellect that defines our humanity, and how can it be cultivated? These are the questions that I hope to explore this evening. It's interesting that in our world that harbors tremendous antipathy towards the Jewish people, with a wide range of commonly held negative stereotypes, you will never hear people saying, you know, I hate those Jewish people because they're so stupid and ignorant. It could be that one of the few things Jews are respected for is their intelligence. And this is not shocking when we remember that even though Jews make up less than 0.2%, less than 0.2% of the world's population, yet we've garnered 24% of Nobel Prizes. There's a story that in the 19th century, an elderly Jew was traveling on the Trans-Siberian Railroad when an officer from the Tsar's army sat down opposite him. They traveled for a while in silence when suddenly the officer grabbed the Jew by the lapels and said, "Tell me, how is it that you Jews are so much brighter than everyone else?" "Well," the Jew replied, after a moment of silence, "it's because of the herring that we eat." "Herring? Really? Do you have any on you?" "Sure." And the Jew took out a full jar of herring. And the officer said, "How much do you want for that?" 30 rubles, the Jew said. Now back then, this was a huge sum of money. So they exchanged the money for the jar of herring, and the officer immediately took a bite, and suddenly he stopped. "Hey, this is no big deal. I can buy this stuff back in Moscow for just a few kopecks." "You see," the Jew said, "it's working already." So as we explore this topic, we learn that there is a difference between knowledge and wisdom. The old quip goes that knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is realizing that you don't put it into a fruit salad. We actually find these kinds of distinctions in Jewish literature as well. When describing the construction of the tabernacle that was built in the desert after the Exodus from Egypt, the Bible repeatedly describes the people involved in the project as being chachmei lev, wise-hearted. Now, one could describe people as having wisdom and being wise, But this is not necessarily the same as being wise-hearted. Is there a difference? So the Midrash says to Lamentations, the book of Lamentations, the Midrash Rabbah there in chapter 2 says that if someone tells you there is wisdom among the nations of the world, you can believe them. But if they tell you that there is Torah among the nations of the world, don't believe it. Chachma, wisdom, is intellect. Chachmat halev, wisdom of the heart, refers not simply to intellectual attainment, but it includes emotional refinement, maturity, and character development. Raw knowledge is only useful when it's possessed by people with chachmat halev, with wisdom of the heart. The Talmud states in Tractate Chulin 133a that whoever teaches Torah to a person of unfit character, that person is likened to someone who worships idols. There's something antithetical between Torah, simply as information and data, and not having the proper vessel to contain it. The Talmud in Tractate Baba Metzia 85a explains that the first temple in Jerusalem was destroyed because people did not recite a blessing prior to their study of the Torah. They studied Torah, but they only saw Torah as knowledge, as information, as data, and not as something godly. This kind of wisdom can be destructive. The sages teach in the Talmud, Tractate Yoma 72b, that if a person is worthy, then the Torah becomes a potion of life, a sam chayim. But if the person is not worthy, the Torah itself can become a potion of death. In the Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat 31a, Rabba Bar Rav Huna says, every person who possesses knowledge and Torah learning, but without the fear of God, without a profound awe and reverence of God, that person is like a treasurer who is entrusted with the inner keys to the treasury, but doesn't have the outer keys. They'll never be able to enter. That's what we encounter when we see someone that has knowledge, but not a fear of God. Rabbi Yanai proclaimed, "Woe to him who has no courtyard, but makes a fence for it." Rav Yehuda said, "The Holy One, blessed is He, created the world only so that people will be awed by Him." God created the world so that people will have fear of heaven. As the verse says in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 14, God has done it so that men should fear Him. So we see there's a big difference between knowledge and wisdom. It's not the same thing. Knowledge is available to virtually anyone. Knowledge can be available to virtually anyone. But wisdom is only available to those with a deep respect for God, to those who place ultimate truth before personal truth. Joseph is the first person in the Bible to be called wise. And he understood that whatever insight that he had came from God. After hearing Pharaoh recount his unusual dreams and then ask Joseph to interpret them, because he has heard that Joseph has this ability to interpret dreams, Joseph responds in Genesis chapter 41, verse 16, "This is beyond me. It is God who will respond." And the prophet Jeremiah echoes this in chapter 9, verses 22 to 23. The prophet says, "Thus says the Almighty, let not the wise man glorify himself with his wisdom, for only with this may one glorify himself, contemplating and knowing me." So just having smarts and just having knowledge by itself is nothing to be proud of. What a person can feel good about is if their knowledge and their wisdom leads to an understanding of God and is connected to God. In the Holy Temple, it's interesting, the light and illumination that came from the menorah, the candelabra, that light symbolized wisdom. Now we know that people living west of the land of Israel, like us here in Canada, anyone in North America, so we face east when we pray toward the location of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. The Talmud in Tractate Bava Basra 25b says that if you want to become wise, you should slightly orient yourself to face south. Meaning you're going to face east when you pray, but tilt your head a little bit, maybe your body a little bit to the south. Why? The reason for this is that in the Holy Temple, the menorah, the candelabra, was positioned in the southern part, in the south of the Holy Temple. So we have this symbol of wisdom, of intelligence, of knowledge, the holy menorah and its radiance. But what's interesting is that even though Moses was the greatest prophet who will ever live, Moses could not understand God's instructions on how to construct the menorah. The Talmud tells us in Tractate Shabbat 22b that God had to show him visually what it looked like. The instructions, the verbal instructions by themselves were not enough. Moses didn't grasp it. He had to be shown what it looked like. The Midrash says it was a menorah of fire. And this midrashic teaching is actually reflected in the text of Scripture itself. Because when describing the construction of the menorah in Exodus chapter 25, the end of the chapter, verse 40 says, "See," God says to him, "See, look, and make, according to the form, according to the diagram that you were shown on the mountain." It's amazing that we're being told here that Moses was shown something. He was shown what the menorah was supposed to look like. The point I'm trying to make is that true wisdom is never independent of God. Real wisdom is divine knowledge. So here we have the symbol of wisdom and knowledge, and yet the greatest prophet was not able to, on his own, understand the instructions for constructing it until God had to show him literally what it looked like. So how do we attain wisdom? So the Talmud in Tractate Brachot 55a has a very intriguing teaching. Rabbi Yochanan said, "The Holy One, blessed is He, only grants wisdom to those who have wisdom. And we see this in the book of Daniel, in chapter 2, verse 21, which says, "He gives wisdom to the wise, and knowledge to those who know how to reason." And the Talmud here continues by quoting Rav Tachlifa, who lived in the West. Now the Talmud is the Babylonian Talmud. The west of Babylon is Israel. So he is an Israeli scholar who lived in Israel. And he said that we learn this idea that God only gives wisdom to those who have wisdom. He said that we learn it from the book of Exodus, chapter 31, verse 6, where the Torah says, "I have endowed the heart of every wise-hearted person with wisdom." Who does God give wisdom to? Those who are already wise-hearted. So this is the teaching, a very famous teaching from the Talmud tractate Brachot 55a. And the problem here is obvious. If God only endows wise-hearted people with wisdom, from where do they get the initial dose of wisdom so they could get more wisdom? It seems like a catch-22. So a number of different answers have been offered to this problem. The most well-known answer is suggested by Rav Chaim of Volozhin, the main protege, the main student of the great Gaon of Vilna. He suggests this approach both in his magnum opus called the Nefesh HaChaim, as well in his commentary to Pirkei Avot called Ruach Chaim. And he says that the initial wisdom, that seed that we have to have in order for God to give us more wisdom, he says the initial wisdom that we can cultivate on our own is the fear of God. A profound awe, respect, and reverence for the Almighty. And if you have that, you have enough fear of God, that's enough wisdom to allow God to give you more. Because this fear of God forms an airtight receptacle in which God's wisdom can then be contained and preserved. King David writes about this in Psalm 111, verse 10. Reshit Chachma Yirat Hashem. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. The fear of God is the prerequisite to being able to have wisdom. And Solomon, his son, says essentially the same thing in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, Solomon says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. He switches it around basically, but the same idea. And in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10, he says exactly the same thing. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. And we find the same idea in the book of Iyov. The book of Iyov, where Job says in chapter 28, verse 28, the fear of God is wisdom. So the problem again was that if God only gives wisdom to those who have wisdom, where did they get the initial wisdom from? They get it from their fear of God, which is itself wisdom, and then becomes the foundation upon which God will then grant further wisdom. In the third chapter of Pirkei Avot, Chapters of the Fathers, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, if there is no fear of God, there is no wisdom. Again, repeating this idea that in order to have wisdom, there has to be first a foundation of Yirat Hashem, fear, awe, reverence, respect for God. The ability to cultivate and generate fear of God, according to our sages, is actually the only thing that is entirely in our control. The Talmud teaches in Brachot 33a, Hakol bidei shamayim, chutz miyirat shamayim. Everything is under the control of heaven except for the fear of heaven. The only thing that I can do on my own accord is cultivate and generate from within me a fear of God. So that's the first approach to our dilemma. If God only grants wisdom to the wise, how do we get the original dose of wisdom to which God can then add wisdom? We're able to get that by developing the fear of God, which is, again, the beginning of wisdom. Another approach to our question was taken by Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, the famed mashgiach, the spiritual director, if you will, of the Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem. Rav Chaim writes that the Almighty imbues people with wisdom who have a passionate thirst and desire for it. All you need to get it going is a desire for it, a thirst for it. And if you have that desire, then God will give you wisdom. The best example of this is from the wisest person who ever lived, King Solomon. When Solomon became the king of Israel at the tender age of 12 years, God came to him in a dream that is recounted in the first book of Kings, chapter 3. And in the dream, God says to Solomon, request what I should give to you. Basically, ask whatever you want. And Solomon says that he's been crowned to rule in place of his father David. His father David is no longer alive. Solomon is now the king. But he says, I'm young. And I don't really know how to properly lead the people. And Solomon feels challenged with the prospect of leading this great nation. He says it's huge, what a large nation it is, so many people. So what does he ask for? Solomon asks that God grant him an understanding heart so that he'll be able to judge God's people. That's what this 12-year-old child asks for. Please give me an understanding heart so I may be able to judge your people. And God was very pleased with this request and said to Solomon, because you have requested this, and you have not requested length of days, and have not requested riches, and have not requested the life of your enemies, but you have requested understanding to comprehend justice, behold, I have acted in accordance with your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, such that there has never been anyone like you before, nor will anyone like you ever arise. Furthermore, God said, even that which you did not request, I have granted to you, even riches and honor all of your days. So God gives wisdom to those who seek wisdom, because this itself shows that they are wise. They may not have the wisdom yet, but you are demonstrating a level of wisdom simply by wanting it, desiring it. And that's what the Talmud means by saying that God grants wisdom to the wise. Meaning that those people who understand the value of wisdom, and because they understand the value of wisdom, they desire it. These people are considered sufficiently wise for God to invest in them. The Midrash to Ecclesiastes, the Midrash to Sefer Kohelet that was written by King Solomon, tells a story of a noble woman who asked Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta, what is meant by the saying that God gives wisdom to those who are wise? She said, wouldn't it make more sense for God to give wisdom to those who are not wise? Don't they need it much more? So Rabbi Yossi said to her, my daughter, if two people, one who is poor and one who is rich, should come to you to borrow money, to whom would you lend? Who would you lend the money to? And she answered him, I would lend it to the rich man. And he asked her why. Why would you lend it to the rich man and not the poor man? So she said, well, if he has a loss, he'll still have money to pay me back. But if a poor person has a loss, where would he get the money to pay me? So Rav Yossi said to her, let your ears hear what your mouth is saying. If the Holy One, blessed is he, would have given wisdom to the foolish, they would squander it and waste it. So he gives wisdom to the wise, so that instead of sitting in the theaters and in unclean places, they will sit in the synagogues and in the houses of study. God sees wisdom as an important investment, and God seeks to imbue wisdom in those that he knows will use it wisely. These are the people who are motivated by a desire for wisdom because they appreciate its importance. Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, known as Ramban, or Nachmanides, writing in the 13th century, in his commentary to the book of Exodus, chapter 35, verse 21, he notes that none of the Jews who were freed from slavery in Egypt ever had an opportunity to learn the artistic skills that were needed to build the tabernacle in the desert and its vessels. So how were they able to do it? How were these former slaves able to engage in engineering and architecture and designing clothing and the vessels, very complicated craftsmanship? How were they able to do it? So the Ramban explains that they had a burning desire and determination to participate in building this holy sanctuary for God. They were moved to volunteer. As the Torah describes them, their hearts were lifted up. Their hearts were lifted up in this project. And because of this desire, God filled their hearts with the knowledge and the skills they would need to construct the tabernacle and its vessels and the garments for the priests. This is the prerequisite for wisdom. A motivation for wisdom, a desire for wisdom. There's a story about a famous artist who was once asked, if your entire studio were to be engulfed in flames and all of your masterpieces were endangered and you could save only one thing, what would it be? And the artist replied, I would save the fire. Because much more important than the paintings was the passion to create. So we actually reflect this recognition of the vital nature of wisdom and our desire for it by making it the very first thing that we ask for in our daily prayers. We make 13 requests of God in the formal prayer recited every weekday morning, afternoon, and evening. We ask for personal needs and we ask for communal needs. But the very first thing that we seek is knowledge, understanding, and intelligence. The Talmud in Tractate Nedarim 41a says that if you have wisdom, you have everything. If you lack wisdom, nothing else you have really matters. Our intellect is our most fundamental and precious possession. No person is really considered truly poor unless they are poor in intellect. Recognizing the true worth of wisdom and desiring it will have God respond by granting it to us. That is the second approach to our problem of how does a person get the initial wisdom for God to be able to grant them further wisdom. There's a third approach to our question, which sees wisdom itself as something that is already implanted in our hearts and is latent within us. Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pakuda writes in the introduction to his classic Chovos HaLevavos, Duties of the Heart, that wisdom is embedded in us, and it's part of our nature, like water hidden in the depths of the earth. And he writes that the man of understanding will always search for it to the best of his abilities until he uncovers it, reveals it, and draws it out, like one would do to get at water hidden in the depths of the earth. If we are motivated, we can excavate this treasure that's latent within us. Otherwise, it will be lost. This is similar to a seed. If you hoe and plow and water and till, whatever you need to do, the seed will grow. Otherwise, it will rot. We are intrinsically wise-hearted people, but we're often unaware of our potential. God invests us with a spirit of wisdom, but we have to draw it out. Our sages teach in Tractate Megillah 6b, if a person says they toiled, didn't find, don't believe them. And if they say they didn't toil, but they found, also don't believe them. But if they say that I have toiled and I found, you can believe them. The sages here are saying that it's impossible to acquire wisdom without working and toiling. But wisdom is not a result of the toiling. It's not that A produces B. You have to toil, but the wisdom does not come as a result of the toiling. If the person toils and demonstrates their desire, God will grant them wisdom and they will find it. That's why the Talmud uses the word that they toiled and they found it. When it uses the word find, it's almost serendipitous. It's not a direct result. I toiled and then, oh, look, I found it. God will grant them wisdom and they will find it as a gift. The Midrash Tanchuma says, this is like a person who comes to buy wine or oil from a merchant. If the merchant is experienced, he will sniff their container before filling it. If he smells it previously contained wine, so he'll fill it with wine. And if it smells like oil, he'll fill it with oil. So too, God rewards the one who has worked to develop their natural intellectual faculties. We have these as part of who we are already. And if we work at them and strive and cultivate, God will then reward our efforts by granting us wisdom. Torah literature is replete with guidance on how to acquire wisdom, how to maintain it, and ultimately how to increase it. The biblical books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, authored by King Solomon, are treasure troves of inspiration and guidance. An entire Talmudic tractate, Pirkei Avot, Chapters of the Fathers, has a significant amount of material devoted to helping us gain clarity as we seek to develop our intellects and increase our wisdom and Torah knowledge. We've already seen from this work the importance of fearing God. Another theme is the critical role played by humility. There are numerous teachings in Pirkei Avot about the role that humility plays in developing our wisdom. One is from Rabbi Akiva. In the 3rd chapter of Pirkei Avot, he says, Siag lechachma shtika. A protective fence for wisdom is silence. The person that is humble is able to listen, not have to talk all the time. And that humility allows them to learn. Probably the most well-known of these teachings on humility is the beginning of the 4th chapter of Pirkei Avot, a teaching by Ben Zoma. And he asks rhetorically, who is the wise person? And he answers, the one who learns from everyone. Now, obviously, to have the attitude in life that there is something that everyone on the planet can teach me, no matter who I meet, each one of them has something they can teach me, that person has to have a foundation of humility. I'm going to conclude tonight's presentation with a few stories that illustrate wisdom in action. The first story is about a young man named Benjamin who just finished attending a yeshiva high school. Yeshiva is where people study the Torah. And he was at a high school where that's what they did. They studied Torah. And he wanted to continue studying in a yeshiva to advance in his study of Talmud and Jewish law. However, his parents were insisting that he go and study at a university. So Benjamin went to speak with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein for advice. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was the greatest rabbinic sage in probably the second half of the 20th century. And Rav Moshe said he'd like Benjamin's father to come in to discuss the matter. So his father reluctantly traveled to Lower Manhattan. Rav Moshe Feinstein lived in the Lower East Side. And the father came to meet with Rav Feinstein, and he told the Rav the following. He said, I'm a mathematician, and I want my son to enter the same field. I want my son to become a mathematician like me. And he said, I understand, Rabbi, that you would prefer that he remain in yeshiva. I understand that. But this fellow said, our sages teach, here now he's quoting the Talmud to the rabbi, our sages teach that there are 3 partners in the creation of a person: the Father, the Mother, and God. Rabbi, you represent God's perspective here, but both my wife and I want our son to attend university next year, and the Torah says to follow the majority. So Rav Moshe smiled and said to this professor of mathematics, or this mathematician, he said, I believe your arithmetic is wrong. Think of the partnership of the Father, the Mother, and God. Think of it as having 9 parts. 3 parts belong to God, 3 belong to you, and 3 belong to your wife. Because again, for each of you and your wife, there were 3 partners that created you. So he said, I'm afraid that you've overlooked the fact that 1/3 of your share and 1/3 of your wife's share belong to God, since he was a partner in your creation. So if you add those 2 parts to God's 3 parts, then God has 5 parts out of 9, while you and your wife remain only with 4 parts out of the 9 parts. And if the majority rules, then God gets his way, and your son should remain in yeshiva. This mathematician was so impressed with Rav Feinstein's wisdom and brilliant logic that he agreed to keep his son Benjamin in yeshiva the following year. The second story is about a secular university professor from the land of Israel. And he wrote a book about his memoirs. And in this book, he writes about waiting to board a flight one day in the airport in Rome. So this professor is in Rome, and he's going to be taking a flight from Rome. And he notices in the airport, he's waiting for the flight, he notices a Jewish man, a religious Jewish man, who is sitting nearby, and he looks familiar, this older man. And finally, the professor realized who it was. This is obviously a famous religious personality. Probably his picture appeared in Israeli newspapers. And so the professor realized it was Rav Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman, the famed Panovitcher Rav. So the professor said that, it felt nice seeing a fellow Jew here far away from home. And although he said, in Israel, I probably would never go over and say hello, he went over and introduced himself to the rabbi. He walked over, extended his hand, he said, Shalom Aleichem, and the rabbi shook his hand. But the professor was bareheaded. It wasn't clear who he was. And the rabbi asked if he was Jewish. And the professor said, yes, I'm Jewish. And the rabbi wrapped his arms around the professor and gave him a very warm hug. The professor felt a little bit uncomfortable. And he said, if the Rav would only know what kind of sinner I am, he wouldn't hug and kiss me. This is what he says to Rav Kahaneman. He says, I'm not sure you would be hugging and kissing me if you knew what kind of sinner I was. At that point, Rav Kahaneman embraced him once again and said, if you would only know how much God loves you, despite the fact that you're a sinner, you wouldn't sin so much. And in the professor's memoirs, he wrote that he didn't completely turn his life around after this encounter. But he writes that he began putting more thought into his life, and he tried to start improving his life in different ways. God helps people to say the right thing when they need to say something special. I sometimes experience this when I'm doing counseling. I sometimes will say something to a person or to a couple, and to myself, I shake my head and I say, did I just say that? I say, that's not me. I would never have said a thing like that. And I realize where it probably came from. I realized that, no, that wasn't what I would normally say. I realized that God gave me those words. And I believe that God gave Rav Kahaneman the right words to say to this professor. In the book of Psalms, chapter 41, verse 2, King David writes, praiseworthy is the one who acts cleverly with the needy. Maskil et hadal, who is wise and clever with the poor, with the needy. One of my favorite stories, I've told this many times, is about the Satmar Rebbe. Satmar Rebbe was a pious and holy Hasidic Rebbe. He lived in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and was known for being very generous. His Hasidim would give him a tremendous amount of money, which he distributed very generously. And there's a story about an Israeli man who was not Hasidic, but he needed money desperately. His wife was having emergency surgery, and he was desperate, and he figured, I'm not Hasidic, the Rebbe doesn't know me, but I'm going to try. I'm going to go to the Rebbe and see if I can get some help. And he comes to the Rebbe and he describes the situation, that his wife needs surgery. And the Rebbe asks him, how much do you need? And he says, it would be great if you can give me $10,000. So the Rebbe directed his assistant to write this man a check for $9,700. And the assistant gives it to the fellow, and he's overjoyed. And after he leaves, the assistant asked the Satmar Rebbe, this man came in asking for $10,000, and you give him $9,700? Why don't you just give him the $10,000? So the Rebbe said, listen, if he came in asking for $10,000 and I gave him $10,000, he would leave here kicking himself that he didn't ask for more. That's why I didn't give him every penny. This is someone who, in his dealing with people that are in need, know how to do it. They do it with wisdom and with intelligence. One last story. The great Hasidic master of Naphtali of Ropshitz said once that no one ever got the better of him except for a little girl. He said he came once to the small hamlet called Zabov, where there were just 10 adult males. The whole little town, that's all they had, 10 adult males. And this town boasted that they had both a synagogue and a cemetery. So Rav Naphtali encountered a little girl, and he said to her, I don't understand. He said, if you have a synagogue for which you need a minyan, you need 10 adult males to be able to pray, so then why do you have a cemetery? Because if one of the men dies, there will be no minyan. You won't be able to pray, so why do you need a cemetery? And if you have a cemetery and someone dies, what's the point of having the synagogue? So without any hesitation, she answered, the cemetery is only for those outsiders who happen to be passing through our town. And that's how a little girl got the better of Rav Naphtali of Ropshitz.